For 74 years, Marguerite Calloway believed she had been thrown away. She believed nobody remembered her name. Nobody kept her photograph. Nobody whispered about her at kitchen tables or wondered where she had gone. Then, at 78 years old, a dying man sent her a key to an abandoned schoolhouse buried deep in the West Virginia hills. Inside that schoolhouse, she found a register. Inside that register, she found hundreds of forgotten names. And on one yellowed page, halfway down written in ink so faded it had nearly disappeared, she found her own. What happened next would unravel 74 years of silence, expose a secret kept across 3 generations, and reveal a kind of love so fierce it had chosen to be forgotten rather than let a child be harmed. Stay with me, because this story doesn't begin when the truth is discovered. It begins when an old woman finally decides she deserves to hear it. If stories like this stay with you the way they stay with me, take a moment now and subscribe. It's free. It helps more people find these stories. And I promise you this one is worth staying for. The morning fog rolled down from the Appalachian ridgeline, the way it always did, slow and heavy, like something the mountains were reluctant to release. It drifted through the hollows and settled across the rooftops of a small neighborhood just outside Charleston, West Virginia, where the houses sat close together and the porches sagged under decades of weather and memory. On one of those porches, in a wooden rocking chair that had long since stopped creaking because every joint had worn itself smooth, sat Marguerite Calloway. Maggie to anyone who might have used her name, though truthfully very few people did anymore. She was 78 years old. Her hands resting in her lap were the hands of a woman who had spent her life working with thread and needle and iron. Seamstress hands, strong once, now thin, mapped with veins spotted with age. On the small table beside her sat a cup of black coffee, a pair of reading glasses with a crack across the left lens, and a tin box no larger than a man's fist. The box was old, older than Maggie's memory of it. Its lid was scratched, its corners dented, its original label long since worn away. Inside it were buttons, dozens of them. Small silver buttons, mismatched in size but identical in style. Maggie did not know where the box came from. She did not know who had given it to her. She only knew that it had been with her for as long as she could remember, traveling from foster home to foster home, bedroom to bedroom, life to life. Every few days, usually in the evening when the house grew quiet, she would open the lid and run her fingers across the buttons, not counting them, not examining them, simply touching them, the way a person touches something sacred, without fully understanding why. This particular morning, the fog was thicker than usual. Maggie could barely see the mailbox at the end of her walkway. She sipped her coffee. The neighborhood was silent. No children walking to school, no dogs barking. Just the fog and the chair and the quiet ticking of a life measured in routines. Maggie had lived alone for as long as most people could remember. No husband, no children, no family photographs on the walls inside. The house was clean but spare. A sewing machine sat in the front room near the window where the light was best. Fabric scraps filled a basket beside it. On the kitchen counter, a single plate, a single fork, a single glass, washed and dried, and placed in the same position every evening. The geometry of solitude. Everything in its place because there was no one to move it. She had entered the foster care system in the autumn of 1952, 4 years old. The record said her parents were deceased. The record said very little else. Over the years, she had requested more information twice. Both times, the responses came back the same way. Incomplete files, limited documentation, no further details available. After the second letter, she stopped asking. Not because she stopped caring, because she learned that some doors, no matter how hard you knock, were never going to open from the other side. 7 homes. She passed through 7 foster homes before she turned 18. Some were tolerable, others were not. In one, she shared a room with 4 other girls and slept on a mattress so thin she could feel the bed frame through the fabric. In another, the family was kind but distracted. She moved through their house like a quiet ghost, noticed but never quite seen. She learned early that foster care was not about finding a family. It was about waiting, waiting for someone to choose you, waiting for someone to keep you, and eventually waiting for the next goodbye. There was a Christmas she never forgot. 1959. She was 11. The foster family she lived with had 3 biological children. On Christmas Eve, Maggie helped wrap their presents. She cut the paper. She tied the ribbons. She wrote the gift tags in her neatest handwriting. That night, she lay in bed listening to the family laughing downstairs. She imagined what it would feel like to walk down those stairs in the morning and find something with her name on it. She fell asleep, imagining it so vividly she could almost feel the wrapping paper beneath her fingers. In the morning, she came downstairs. The tree was surrounded by torn paper and empty boxes. The children were already playing with their new toys. Nothing under the tree had her name on it. She stood in the doorway for a long time. No one looked up. She walked back upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, opened the tin box, and held the buttons in her palm. They were cold and smooth and familiar, the only gift she had ever received that no one had taken back. Years later, in the spring of 1966, she turned 18 and aged out of the system. There was no ceremony, no farewell, no forwarding address. She packed her suitcase, the same suitcase she had carried since she was 12, and walked out the front door of her last foster home on a Tuesday afternoon. The family was eating lunch. She heard silverware against plates as she closed the door behind her. That evening, she bought a small cake from a bakery downtown, yellow cake, white frosting, the cheapest one on the shelf. She sat alone on a bench near the Kanawha River. The water moved slowly beneath the bridge. She had no candle, so she simply looked at the cake and whispered the words to herself. Happy birthday. Then she ate a single slice, wrapped the rest in its paper box, and carried it back to the rooming house where she had rented a bed for the week. For the next 60 years, Maggie built her life the way a person builds a wall, one careful brick at a time. She learned to sew. She worked in alteration shops, then bridal boutiques, then opened her own small tailoring business from her front room. She pressed shirts, hemmed trousers, repaired coats, replaced zippers. Her hands became known for their precision. Customers returned year after year. She never advertised. She never needed to. The work came through word of mouth, and word of mouth was enough. But the question never left. It sat in the back of her mind the way an old splinter sits beneath the skin, invisible, mostly painless but always there. If my parents loved me, why did nobody ever come back? She had made peace with the silence. Or so she believed. Peace and resignation can look remarkably alike from the outside. The letter arrived on a Monday, early October. The fog had cleared by mid-morning, and Maggie walked to the mailbox wearing a cardigan she had sewn herself 20 years ago. The mailbox usually contained utility bills and grocery store flyers. Today it contained a plain white envelope with a return address she did not recognize. A law office in Beckley, West Virginia. She carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, stared at it for several minutes before opening it. The letter was brief. A man named Reverend Silas Whitfield, currently a patient at Raleigh General Hospital, had requested that his attorney contact her. Reverend Whitfield was 89 years old. He was dying. According to the letter, he had spent several years attempting to locate Maggie, and he wished to speak with her before his death. Additionally, he had left her a property, a former schoolhouse in McDowell County, along with its contents. Maggie read the letter twice. The name meant nothing to her. Silas Whitfield. She had never heard it, never seen it written anywhere. She had no family, no distant relatives, no connections to McDowell County or anywhere else. The letter made no sense. She reached deeper into the envelope. A brass key slid into her palm, old heavy, its teeth worn down by decades. Attached to it with a short piece of twine was a folded note. The handwriting was unsteady, the letters pressed hard into the paper, as though written by someone gathering the last of their strength. Maggie unfolded it. 4 words. You were never abandoned. Her hand began to tremble. She set the note down, picked it up again, read it once more. The words did not change. Then something else shifted inside the envelope. Something small and hard. She tilted the paper and a single object dropped onto the kitchen table, bouncing once before settling beside her coffee cup. A silver button. Maggie stopped breathing. She knew that button. She knew the size, the weight, the slightly raised pattern on its surface. She had held buttons exactly like it 10,000 times. They were sitting 6 feet away from her inside the tin box on her bedside table. The same buttons she had carried since childhood. The same buttons no one had ever explained. Someone knew about the box. Someone had always known. For a long moment, Maggie simply sat at her kitchen table, the key in one hand, the button in the other, and the fog of 74 years beginning for the first time to thin. 3 days passed before she found the courage to go. She could not drive, her eyes were no longer reliable enough. And the bus route to McDowell County had been discontinued years ago. She considered calling a taxi, but the distance was over 100 miles, and the fare would have cost more than her monthly grocery budget. On Thursday morning, she walked to the bus station downtown, carrying a small bag and the tin box tucked inside her coat pocket. She planned to take the Greyhound as far as Beckley and find a way from there. At the station, a young woman sat on the bench beside the ticket counter, typing rapidly on a laptop. She looked to be in her early 30s, dark auburn hair pulled back, a press badge clipped to her jacket, a notebook open beside her filled with handwriting so fast it barely qualified as legible. The young woman glanced up as Maggie approached the counter. McDowell County. The ticket agent shook his head. "Ma'am, there's no direct service down there anymore. Hasn't been for years. You'd have to transfer in Beckley, then find someone to drive you the rest of the way. And honestly, there's not much left down there to visit." Maggie stood at the counter, uncertain, the tin box pressed against her ribs through the fabric of her coat. 74 years of questions, 100 miles of bad road, and a body that reminded her daily it was not as willing as her mind. "Excuse me." The voice came from the bench. The young woman with the press badge was standing now. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to listen, but did you say McDowell County?" Maggie turned. "I did. I'm heading there tomorrow. I'm writing a piece on the old coal towns, the ones that emptied out after the mines closed." She extended her hand. "Nell Braddock. I write for the Gazette." Maggie studied her. There was something direct about the young woman's expression. Not pushy, curious. The kind of curiosity that came from genuine interest rather than obligation. "I could drive you," Nell offered. "I'm going right through there. It's no trouble." Maggie hesitated. She had spent most of her life avoiding favors. Favors created obligations, and obligations created disappointment. But the key was in her pocket. The button was in her box, and the man who sent them was dying. "All right," Maggie said. "Thank you." They left early the next morning. Nell's car was a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard and a back seat full of file folders and old newspapers. They drove south through the mountains as autumn painted the hills in copper and rust. The roads narrowed as they climbed. The towns grew smaller. Then the towns disappeared entirely. McDowell County had once been the coal capital of the world. Nell explained this as they drove the way a reporter explains things with facts and dates and a respect for what had been lost. In the 1950s, more than 100,000 people had lived here. Now fewer than 18,000 remained. Entire towns had vanished. Schools, churches, company stores, all gone. The mountains had swallowed them back. Maggie watched through the window. Abandoned houses stood along the roadside like old teeth in a broken jaw. Rusted mining equipment sat in overgrown fields. A church steeple rose above the trees, its white paint peeling its doors chained shut. "It's hard to believe anyone lived here," Nell said quietly. Maggie said nothing, but she understood. She understood what it meant for a place to be forgotten. She had been that place her entire life. The address from the attorney led them down a gravel road that ended at a rusted gate hanging crooked on a single hinge. Beyond it, at the top of a small hill, stood a one-room schoolhouse. Maggie asked Nell to stop the car. For a full minute, she simply looked. The building was smaller than she had imagined. White paint, or what had once been white, clung in patches to warped clapboard walls. Two tall windows flanked the front door, both intact but clouded with age. A bell tower sat on the roof, leaning slightly to the left, as though the years had slowly pushed it off balance. Tall grass surrounded the structure on every side, golden in the October light. And yet something about it, something she could not name, felt familiar. Not the way a memory feels familiar, the way a feeling does. As though she had been cold for a very long time, and this place, this forgotten building on a forgotten hill, was the first warmth she had felt in years. She stepped out of the car. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then went silent. The key fit the lock on the front door. The mechanism resisted, then gave way with a deep, heavy click that echoed across the hillside like a heartbeat. The door swung inward. The smell reached her first. Old wood, dust, paper, time. Then the light afternoon sun pouring through the tall windows, catching thousands of dust particles suspended in the air, drifting slowly, weightlessly like snow falling inside a dream. Rows of small wooden desks filled the room. A blackboard stretched across the front wall. Faded chalk marks remained visible, a date written in the upper corner. March 15th, 1968. The last day anyone had taught here. The desks were arranged as though the children had simply stood up, walked out, and never returned. Maggie moved slowly between the rows. Her fingers brushed the surface of one desk. Initials had been carved into the wood. TR plus SM. Names of children who had once sat here. Children who had laughed and fidgeted and stared out windows and dreamed about what their lives might become. A sadness settled over her. Not sharp, not sudden. The slow, deep kind. The kind that comes from recognizing something you have always known, but never spoken aloud. This place was not abandoned. It was forgotten. And Maggie understood the difference better than most. At the front of the room stood a teacher's desk. Unlike everything else, it was clean. No dust, no cobwebs. Someone had been caring for it. Recently. A chill moved down her spine. On the desk sat a framed photograph. A man, tall, thin, white-haired, stood in front of this very schoolhouse smiling. His eyes were gentle. His hand rested on the shoulder of a young girl beside him. Maggie did not recognize the girl, but she recognized the man, not from memory, from the feeling the photograph carried: kindness, patience, purpose. Beside the photograph sat a small envelope. Her breath caught. Written across the front in the same trembling handwriting as the note attached to the key were two words: for Maggie. She opened it. A single sheet of paper. The message was short. You were never entry number 47. You were always my promise. The answers are here, but you must be willing to find them. Start with the children. Maggie lowered the letter. Her eyes moved across the room. The children. Rows of empty desks stared back at her. Then her gaze drifted to the rear corner of the classroom. A tall wooden filing cabinet stood against the wall. Unlike the desks, it was locked. The brass key fit perfectly. The top drawer opened with a groan. Inside were hundreds of carefully organized folders. Student records, attendance reports, photographs, birth certificates, decades of forgotten lives arranged in alphabetical order. Maggie began turning through them, one folder then another. The afternoon light slowly softened as the hours passed. Nell sat quietly near the window, watching, sensing that whatever was happening in this room was not something she should interrupt. Then Maggie noticed it. At the very back of the bottom drawer, behind a false wooden panel that nearly blended into the cabinet itself, sat a hidden compartment. Her pulse quickened. She pressed the panel. It shifted. Behind it rested a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age, its corners worn smooth. No title, no markings, just old brown leather darkened by time and touch. She lifted it carefully. It was heavier than it looked, as though it carried something far more than pages. A folded note rested on top. One sentence. Some children are forgotten by the world. Others are hidden to protect them. Maggie opened the book. The first page read in careful handwriting, "The Orphan Register." Below it, columns of names, hundreds of them. Dates, locations, status notes, page after page of children. Maggie turned them slowly, her fingers trembling, the afternoon dissolving around her. Then she stopped. Her breath left her body. Halfway down one yellowed page, written in fading black ink, was an entry she would have recognized anywhere. Marguerite Calloway, age 4. Status must be hidden, not abandoned, not surrendered, not orphaned, hidden. The tin box slipped from her coat pocket. It struck the wooden floor with a bright metallic sound, and the lid popped open. Silver buttons scattered across the old floorboards, rolling in every direction, catching the last of the afternoon light as they spun and settled into the cracks between the planks. Maggie did not pick them up. She did not move. She simply sat in that old wooden chair, holding the register open in her lap, staring at the 4 words that had waited 74 years to reach her. Must be hidden. And for the first time since she was 4 years old, Marguerite Calloway realized that the story she had told herself, the only story she had ever known, might not be true. Outside, the sun dropped behind the West Virginia hills. The schoolhouse darkened. The buttons lay scattered across the floor like small silver stars fallen from a sky no one had looked at in a very long time. And somewhere in a hospital 60 miles away, an 89-year-old man who had kept a promise for 3/4 of a century was running out of time to explain why. Maggie did not leave the schoolhouse that night. She could not. Leaving would have meant closing the register, locking the door, driving away from the first honest sentence anyone had ever written about her life. So she stayed. She sat in the old wooden chair with the book open in her lap while darkness filled the classroom and the West Virginia hills disappeared into black. Nell stayed too. She did not ask questions. She found a wool blanket folded inside a supply closet near the back wall, draped it across Maggie's shoulders, and sat quietly on the floor beside the filing cabinet. Sometime after midnight, she fell asleep leaning against it. Maggie did not sleep at all. She read every page of the register, every name, every entry. Some children had been placed with relatives. Others transferred across state lines. Several had their identities changed entirely. New names, new birthdays, new histories written on top of old ones. The register was not a school record. It was a map of vanished lives drawn by someone who refused to let them disappear completely. By the time the first gray light crept through the windows, Maggie had counted 312 names. 312 children hidden across 4 decades. And the man responsible for all of it, Silas Whitfield, was lying in a hospital bed 60 miles east, waiting to die. She closed the register. Her back ached, her eyes burned. The silver buttons still lay scattered across the floor where they had fallen hours ago. She knelt slowly, painfully, and began picking them up one by one. Her knees protested, her fingers fumbled. 2 buttons had rolled beneath a desk, and she had to lower herself nearly to the floor to reach them. It took her almost 15 minutes to collect them all. When she finally pressed the last one back into the tin box and closed the lid, her hands were shaking not from cold, but from the particular exhaustion that comes when the body understands what the mind has not yet accepted. Everything was about to change. Nell woke shortly after dawn. She stretched, rubbed her neck, and looked at Maggie with the careful expression of someone deciding how much to say. "Did you sleep?" "No." "Are you okay?" Maggie considered the question. She was 78 years old. She had spent the night on a wooden chair in an abandoned building reading the names of children who had been erased from history. Her name was among them. "I need to find someone named Dorothy Greer." Nell frowned. "Who is she?" "I don't know yet." Maggie held up a small card she had found tucked into the register beside her entry. On it in Silas's handwriting was a name, a town, and a single instruction. She knows what I cannot say aloud. Ask her about the letters. But I think she's been waiting for me almost as long as he has. Finding Dorothy Greer took Nell 2 days. 2 days of phone calls to county offices that had been consolidated church directories that were out of date and public records that contradicted each other. Twice the trail went cold. Once Nell reached a nephew in Virginia who insisted Dorothy had passed away years ago. She nearly believed him. Then a second call to a different nephew produced a different answer. Dorothy was alive, 91 years old, living at a small assisted care facility in Lewisburg, nearly 3 hours north. They drove in silence most of the way. The mountains softened as they moved north, the ridges growing rounder, the valleys wider. Maggie kept the tin box in her lap. Her thumb moved absently across the lid the way it had for decades. But something about the gesture felt different now. Before it had been a habit born of loneliness. Now it felt like preparation. The facility sat at the end of a quiet road lined with sugar maples. A brick building, single-story, unremarkable. Inside, the hallways smelled of disinfectant and canned soup. A nurse led them to a small room at the end of the east wing. Dorothy Greer sat in a recliner beside a window. She was tiny, barely 5 feet folded into herself by age the way a letter folds along its original creases. Her hair was white and thin. Her eyes behind thick glasses were the pale blue of old denim. A hand-knitted afghan covered her legs. On the windowsill beside her sat a framed photograph of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, smiling, standing outside what appeared to be a mining company clinic. Maggie stopped in the doorway. Dorothy turned her head slowly. For a moment, the old woman simply looked at her. Then her lips parted. "Lord have mercy." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You walk exactly like her." Maggie's chest tightened. "Like who?" "Your mother." The words landed the same way they might have landed if someone had reached across 74 years and touched her face. Maggie gripped the doorframe. Nell, standing behind her, placed a hand gently on her back, but said nothing. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, not the sudden kind, the kind that had been stored for a very long time. "Come sit down, child, please. I have been carrying things that are too heavy for one person." Maggie sat. Nell pulled a chair into the corner and opened her notebook, then closed it again, sensing that whatever was about to happen in this room did not belong on paper. Dorothy reached beneath the afghan on her lap and withdrew a bundle of envelopes. There must have been 50 or 60 of them, thin yellow tied together with a piece of blue ribbon so faded it was nearly white. She placed them on the small table between them, with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. Silas wrote these, one every year, sometimes more. Dorothy's fingers trembled above the stack. "Every single one is about you." Maggie stared at the envelopes. Dates were written across each one, years, decades, a lifetime measured in postmarks. "He sent them to me for safekeeping." Dorothy continued, "In case anything ever happened to him, in case you ever came looking." Maggie reached for the nearest envelope. October 1966, the year she turned 18, the year she aged out of foster care. She opened it carefully. The paper inside was brittle. Silas's handwriting was stronger here, younger, the letters more certain than the ones she had seen on the note attached to the key. "Marguerite graduated high school today. I stood across the street behind the elm tree near the hardware store. She wore a blue dress. She walked alone afterward. No family met her. I wanted to cross the street. I wanted to tell her everything. I did not. The promise holds, but it is getting harder to keep." Maggie lowered the letter. Her jaw clenched. She picked up another. 1981. Easter Sunday. I sat in the last pew at the Methodist Church on Randolph Street. Marguerite was there. She sang every hymn. Her voice is like her mother's. She did not see me. I left before the service ended. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. I could not start the engine. Keeping this promise is the hardest thing I have ever done. Another. 1990. Marguerite opened a tailoring shop today, a small place on Davis Avenue. I stood outside the window and watched her arrange fabric on the counter. She looked content. Not happy, content. There is a difference. Happy is what she deserved. Content is what the silence gave her. I'm sorry for that. Maggie set the letter down. Her hands were steady, but something behind her eyes was breaking apart very slowly, the way ice breaks on a river in early spring, not all at once but in long, quiet fractures that spread wider with every passing second. He was there. Her voice was flat, controlled. He was right there, 3 times, at least 3 times. Dorothy nodded. He could have spoken to me. Yes. He could have told me the truth. Yes. Why didn't he? Dorothy was quiet for a long time. Outside, a cardinal landed on the windowsill and then flew away. Because your parents asked him not to. She paused. And Silas Whitfield was the kind of man who would rather break his own heart than break his word. The silence that followed filled the room like water filling a low place. Maggie did not cry. She had spent too many decades practicing control for that. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the stack of letters as though she could absorb them through her skin. 60 years of someone watching, caring, aching, and choosing every single time not to speak. I need to know why. Maggie's voice had changed. Harder now. The softness of the schoolhouse discovery replaced by something sharper, older. The tone of a woman who had endured too much patience and was no longer willing to wait. I need to know what happened to my parents. Dorothy closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked 10 years older. I know. She reached beneath the Afghan once more. This time, she withdrew a single envelope separate from the others, older, its edges brown with age. Across the front, in handwriting, Maggie had never seen before, were 3 words, for Maggie someday. Your mother wrote this. Dorothy held it out with both hands as though the weight of it required 2. 3 days before she died. Maggie took it. The paper was soft, almost cloth-like from age. She turned it over. The seal had never been broken. No one has read it. Silas read it once, the night your mother gave it to him. He sealed it himself. He told me it was the most important thing he would ever protect. Maggie slid her finger beneath the flap. The old glue released easily, as though it had been waiting. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was neat, careful, the penmanship of someone who understood that these words might be the last ones her daughter would ever receive from her. The first sentence knocked the air from Maggie's lungs. If you are reading this, then we could not come back for you. She kept reading. Each line pulled something loose inside her chest. Her parents, her father, a coal miner, her mother, a nurse at the mining company's clinic, had discovered something they were never meant to find. Children from the county's foster system and orphanages were being quietly funneled into illegal labor deep inside the mines. Not on official rosters, not on any payroll. Orphans, children no one would miss. Children whose absence from the system could be explained away with a forged transfer document or a falsified adoption record. The company used them for the narrowest tunnels, the most dangerous shafts, the work no adult body could perform. Her parents had gathered evidence. Medical records her mother copied from the clinic. Shift logs her father smuggled out in his lunch pail. Testimonies from other miners who had seen the children but were too afraid to speak. They brought the evidence to a county prosecutor. The prosecutor made a phone call. Within a week, the evidence disappeared. Within 2 weeks, her father was fired. Within a month, strangers began watching their house. The letter continued. Maggie read through blurred vision. They realized their daughter was exactly the kind of child the operation targeted. Young, in the system, connected to parents who had become a threat. If anything happened to them, Maggie would become a ward of the state, and the very people they had tried to expose controlled the local child welfare office. So they made a decision. They asked Silas to remove their names from Maggie's records. They asked him to erase every connection between the Calloway family and their daughter. They asked him to make it look as though Maggie had no parents at all, so that no one with power or motive would ever think to look for her. And then the final paragraph, the one that broke her. If our daughter grows up believing we abandon her, then she will never search for us. And if she never searches, they will never find her. We are choosing her hatred over her death. We are choosing her loneliness over her grave. This is not a choice any parent should have to make, but it is the one we are making tonight, because dead children do not grow up to read letters. And hatred, my darling girl, can heal. Death cannot. Maggie put the letter down. She stood up. The chair slid back. Nell looked up from the corner, alarmed. Maggie walked to the window. She pressed both palms against the glass. Outside, the sugar maples were losing their leaves. Gold and red drifted down through the afternoon light. They chose this. Her voice was barely audible. They sat in a room somewhere and decided to let me grow up alone. Dorothy said nothing. 74 years. I blamed them for 74 years. Still nothing. Maggie turned. Her eyes were dry, but her face had changed. Something underneath it had shifted the way the ground shifts before a hillside gives way. And I was right to blame them. Her voice cracked. Because they made the choice. They could have run. They could have taken me with them. They could have found another way. Dorothy looked at her steadily. And if they had, if the people watching had followed, if those men had found you. Maggie opened her mouth, closed it. Your mother held you in her arms the night she wrote that letter. Dorothy's voice trembled but did not break. She held you for 6 hours. She memorized your face. She cut the buttons from her own coat and put them in that tin box so you would carry a piece of her wherever you went. She did not sleep that night. She told me the next morning that she had already died once the moment she decided to let you go. Everything after that was just her body catching up. The room went completely still. Maggie looked down at the tin box in her hands. The buttons. The small silver buttons she had touched 10,000 times without knowing why. She pressed the box against her chest, against the place where the ache had lived for 74 years. And for the first time, standing in a room in a nursing home in a small West Virginia town, she felt something shift inside that space. Not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness would take longer. But the wall that had stood between Maggie and her parents for her entire life developed its first crack. She sat back down. She picked up the letter. She read it again from the beginning, this time more slowly. This time not as a woman who had been abandoned, but as a woman trying for the first time to understand what it might cost to save someone you love by making them believe you never loved them at all. The drive back to McDowell County took most of the following day. Nell drove carefully through the mountain roads, while Maggie sat in the passenger seat holding the bundle of Silas's letters against her chest. Neither spoke much. Certain kinds of silence carry more than conversation ever could. When they arrived at the schoolhouse just before dusk, Maggie knew immediately that something was wrong. The front door was open. She had locked it, she was certain. She remembered the weight of the key turning the click of the mechanism the way she had tested the handle twice before walking away. She remembered because locking doors was something she had done carefully her entire life. When you grow up without a home, every door you finally control matters. Nell stopped the car. Both women sat still for a moment watching. Stay here, Nell said. No. Maggie was already opening her door. They walked up the hill together. The grass was wet with evening dew. Their footsteps made no sound. The schoolhouse door hung open about a foot, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside the room looked almost the same. Almost. The desks had not been moved. The blackboard was untouched. The photograph of Silas still stood on the teacher's desk. But the filing cabinet was open. 3 drawers pulled out. Folders disturbed. Papers shifted. Someone had gone through them quickly, not destroying, but searching. Maggie moved through the room, checking each drawer, each shelf, each corner. Then she stopped at the cabinet where the hidden compartment had been. The false panel was pushed aside. The compartment was empty. The register was still on the teacher's desk where she had left it, but a folder was missing. She knew which one because she had organized everything herself 2 days ago, and her seamstress mind remembered arrangements the way other minds remembered faces. The folder had contained a set of handwritten notes. Silas's private observations about irregularities in the county's child welfare system, names of officials, dates of altered records, questions he had never been able to answer publicly. Gone. Nell stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, studying the scene with the trained eye of someone who had covered enough small-town stories to know what a careful search looked like. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. Maggie nodded. The tin box felt heavier in her pocket, and they knew exactly where to find it. That night, Maggie sat alone in the schoolhouse long after Nell left to find cell service and make calls. The wind pressed against the old windows. The floorboards settled and groaned, the way old buildings do when the temperature drops. The remaining folders lay spread across the teacher's desk. Hundreds of names, hundreds of stories, evidence that someone had spent decades quietly moving children out of danger, and that someone else had spent decades making sure no one ever found out why. Maggie opened the tin box. She counted the buttons by touch. All there, every one. She pressed the lid closed and held the box in both hands. 74 years ago, her mother had cut these buttons from her own coat. She had placed them in this box so her daughter would carry something real, something physical, something that would survive the silence. And now, 7 decades later, someone had walked into this schoolhouse and taken the very evidence her parents had risked their lives to protect. The anger that rose in Maggie's chest was not the sharp, burning kind. It was slower, deeper, the kind of anger that belongs to old women who have spent a lifetime being quiet and have finally decided they are finished. She looked at the register still open on the desk. 312 names. 312 children who had been hidden, moved, protected, erased, not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much to leave exposed. Her parents had died for this. Silas had sacrificed his entire life for this. And now someone wanted it buried again. Maggie closed the register. She placed both hands flat on its cover. No, not this time. Not after 74 years. Not after everything. She was too old to run, too tired to fight. But she was a seamstress. She had spent her whole life taking broken things and making them whole together. Thread and fabric and patience. That was all mending ever required. And somewhere in a hospital room 60 miles east, the only man alive who could explain everything was running out of hours. If Maggie did not reach Silas Whitfield before his heart gave out, the last thread connecting 312 children to the truth would snap. And this time, no one would be able to stitch it back together. Nell drove through the night. The mountain roads were empty, the headlights cutting narrow corridors through darkness so complete, it felt like the hills themselves had closed their eyes. Maggie sat in the passenger seat with the tin box in her lap and the register wedged between her hip and the door. She had refused to leave it behind. 312 names were not staying in an unlocked building. Not tonight. Not after what she had seen. They reached Raleigh General Hospital just before 4 in the morning. The parking lot was nearly deserted. A single fluorescent light buzzed above the emergency entrance, casting a pale green glow across the wet asphalt. Inside, the hallways were quiet in the particular way hospitals become quiet in the hours before dawn. Not peaceful, but suspended, as though the building itself were holding its breath between one outcome and another. A night nurse at the third-floor station looked up when they approached. "Silas Whitfield," Maggie said. "I need to see him." The nurse studied her. "Visiting hours don't start until 8. "I understand that." Maggie placed both hands on the counter. Her voice was steady, but beneath it ran something the nurse must have recognized: urgency pressed flat by a lifetime of self-control. "I also understand he may not have until 8. The nurse glanced at her computer screen, then back at Maggie. Then she stood and walked them down the corridor without another word. The room was small. A single window faced east, though there was nothing to see through it yet but darkness. Machines beeped in slow, measured intervals. The air smelled of antiseptic and something older beneath it, something the cleaning could not quite reach. The particular scent of a body preparing to let go. Silas Whitfield lay propped against two pillows. He was smaller than the photograph had suggested. Age had compressed him, drawn his shoulders inward, thinned his arms to pale lines beneath the hospital gown. An oxygen tube ran beneath his nose. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow but even. Maggie stood in the doorway. For a moment she could not move. This man, this stranger she had never met, whose name she had not known 2 weeks ago, had spent 74 years watching over her life. He had stood across the street at her graduation. He had sat in the back of her church. He had watched her arrange fabric in her shop window and then driven away without a word. He had written letters about her birthdays, her milestones, her ordinary Tuesdays. He had kept a promise so faithfully that it had consumed his entire existence, and he had never once let her know. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed. The vinyl creaked beneath her weight. She placed the tin box on the bedside table next to a plastic cup of water and a small Bible with a cracked spine. For several minutes, she simply sat. The machines beeped. The building hummed. Nell waited outside in the hallway, giving them the room. Then Silas opened his eyes. They were brown, deep brown, the color of river stones after rain. And when they found Maggie's face, something happened inside them. A light, faint but unmistakable, like a match struck in a dark room. "You have your mother's hands." His voice was thin, stripped down to its last threads. But the words arrived with the precision of someone who had rehearsed them for decades. Maggie looked down at her own hands. The hands she had used to thread needles, press seams, mend torn fabric for 60 years. Her mother's hands. No one had ever told her that. No one had ever connected any part of her body to any part of another person. She had lived her entire life believing she came from nowhere. "You knew her." It was not a question. "I knew both of them." Silas's chest rose and fell with effort. "Your father could fix anything mechanical. Engines, pumps, conveyor belts. The mining company depended on him. Your mother ran the clinic. She treated every injury, every illness, every child who came through with bruises they couldn't explain." He paused. The oxygen hissed softly. "They were the bravest people I ever met, and the most afraid." "Why you?" Maggie asked. Of everyone they could have trusted, why a schoolteacher? Silas almost smiled. "Because teachers see children every day. We notice when one disappears. We notice when the records don't match the faces." His eyes drifted toward the ceiling. "Your parents brought me evidence, medical files, work logs, names of children who had been checked out of foster care by people who didn't exist. I helped them build the case. And when the case fell apart, when the prosecutor turned, when the threat started, I helped them build something else. The register." "The register?" He nodded slowly. "Every child we could identify, every family we could reach. We moved them, changed their names, placed them with people we trusted in other counties, other states, teachers, pastors, nurses, ordinary people willing to take extraordinary risks." He turned his head to look at her directly. "The schoolhouse was our station. Children passed through that classroom on their way to safety. 312 of them over the years. Your parents started it. I continued it after they were gone. After they were killed." The word landed heavily. Silas did not flinch. "The mine collapse was not an accident. I could never prove it. Neither could anyone else. But the timing, 3 weeks after your father delivered a second set of evidence to a federal investigator, the timing was not a coincidence." Maggie absorbed this. The machines beeped. The window had begun to lighten at its edges, the first suggestion of dawn pressing against the glass. You could have told me, she said. Any of those times you were near me. At the graduation, at the church, at my shop. You could have walked up and said one word. Yes. Why didn't you? Silas was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped even further, as though the words were coming from somewhere deep inside his chest. Because your mother made me swear. On the night she brought you to me, the last night I saw her alive, she held my hands and made me swear two things. First, that I would never let anyone find you, and second, that I would never let you find them. His eyes glistened. She said that if you knew the truth, you would go looking, and the people who killed them would be waiting. That was 74 years ago. Those people are. Some of them are dead, some are not. Some passed their influence to their children who passed it to theirs. Power does not die with the person who holds it, Marguerite. It transfers, like property, like debt. He paused, like promises. The sunrise reached the window. A thin band of gold appeared along the horizon, casting a warm line across the hospital floor. The light moved slowly toward the bed, toward Silas, toward the space between two people who had been connected for a lifetime without ever being allowed to meet. I broke the promise by sending you that key. His voice wavered. I broke it because I ran out of time to keep it. And because he swallowed. Because 74 years is long enough to make someone carry a wound they didn't earn. Maggie said nothing. The gold light reached the edge of his blanket. Then Silas turned his head toward a small closet in the corner of the room. There is something in there, on the shelf. Would you bring it to me? Maggie stood. Her knees ached, her back protested. But she crossed the room and opened the closet. Inside on the top shelf sat a neatly folded garment wrapped in tissue paper. She lifted it carefully. Even through the wrapping, she could feel the texture of old wool, heavy, dense, the kind of fabric that had been made to last. She carried it back to the bed. Silas watched her with an expression she could not read, somewhere between grief and relief, as though he were witnessing the completion of something that had taken far too long. Open it. Maggie set the parcel on the edge of the bed and folded back the tissue paper. A woman's coat, dark gray wool, nearly black, with a simple collar and straight seams. The style belonged to the late 1940s. The fabric was worn but clean, cared for, preserved with the same meticulous attention that had kept the teacher's desk free of dust for half a century. Maggie's hands stopped. Along the front of the coat, where the buttons should have been, there was nothing. Empty thread loops hung in a vertical line from collar to hem. Every button had been removed. Every single one. The coat was whole, complete, perfectly maintained, except for the small, deliberate absences where something had once held it together. She knew before she looked. She knew the way a body knows its own heartbeat. She reached for the tin box on the bedside table. Her fingers found the lid. It opened with the familiar click that had accompanied every lonely evening, every quiet morning, every Christmas, every birthday, every night she had held those buttons without understanding why. She placed the box beside the coat. The buttons were the same. The size, the weight, the slightly raised floral pattern on each surface. Identical. Every one of them matched the empty loops on the coat the way a key matches a lock it was cut for. She sewed them herself. Silas's voice broke. The night before she gave you up, she sat at her kitchen table and cut every button from her own coat. She put them in that box with her own hands. She said. He stopped, breathed, tried again. She said you would carry her with you even if you never knew it. Maggie did not speak. She could not. 74 years of silence pressed against her chest like a held breath that had finally been released. With shaking fingers, she lifted the first button from the box. Small, silver, worn smooth by decades of touch, her touch. She found the top loop on the coat and threaded the button through. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting. The second button, the third, each one sliding into place with a soft, barely audible click. Each click a year reclaimed. Each button a piece of a mother returning to the place it had always belonged. The room was completely quiet. Even the machines seemed to pause. Nell stood in the doorway, tears running silently down her face. The nurse who had walked them in stood behind her, one hand pressed against her mouth. Maggie reached the last button, the bottom one, the smallest. She had held this particular button more than any other. It had always sat on top inside the box, the first one her fingers found in the dark. She pressed it through the final loop. The coat was whole. She lifted it from the bed and held it against her chest. The wool smelled of cedar and age, and something fainter beneath something she could not name but recognized in the deepest, oldest part of herself. She pressed her face into the collar and closed her eyes. For the first time in 74 years, Marguerite Calloway held her mother. When she opened her eyes, Silas was smiling. A small, exhausted, completed smile. The kind of smile that belongs to a man who has carried a weight for so long that setting it down feels almost like floating. "Promise kept," he whispered. Maggie reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, thin, fragile as paper. She held them the way she held fabric she was afraid of tearing, gently, firmly, with the knowledge that some things once released cannot be gathered again. "Promise kept," she said. Silas closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. The gold light from the window reached his face and rested there warm and steady, as though the morning itself had decided to stay a little longer. He died 4 days later, quietly, in his sleep. The Bible on his bedside table was open to a page he had marked decades ago. Beside it sat a photograph of a young couple standing outside a one-room schoolhouse holding their daughter between them. On the back, in careful handwriting, "The Calloways, 1951, the year before everything changed." The restoration of the schoolhouse took 7 months. Nell wrote the story for the Gazette. It was picked up by regional papers, then national outlets. Historians arrived. Genealogists volunteered. Former foster children contacted Maggie from 36 states. The register's 312 names became 312 searches. 312 attempts to reconnect families separated by fear and time and the deliberate cruelty of powerful men. Not every search succeeded. Some trails had gone cold decades ago. Some people did not want to be found. Some had died without ever learning the truth about why they had been moved, renamed, hidden. But many searches did succeed. And each one, each phone call, each letter, each moment when a voice on the other end of the line said, "I've been looking for you my whole life." Each one proved that Silas and her parents had not sacrificed in vain. The official reopening fell on a Saturday in late September. The morning arrived bright and windless, the Appalachian sky so blue it looked painted. Cars filled the gravel lot before 9. Families came carrying photographs, letters, the small objects people keep when memory is all they have left. Some drove hundreds of miles. Others walked from houses just down the hollow. They did not all know each other, but they recognized something in each other's faces, the particular expression of a person who has spent years missing a piece of themselves and has finally impossibly found it. Maggie stood near the back of the room. As people filled every chair, lined every wall, spilled through the open door onto the grass outside. She wore her mother's coat, every button in place. The wool was too warm for September, but she did not care. She had waited 74 years to wear it. When they asked her to speak, she walked to the front of the room. The old teacher's desk stood beside her, polished, restored, still holding its place after all these decades. She rested one hand on its surface and looked out at the faces before her. "I came here believing I was looking for my parents." Her voice was quiet, but the room was quieter. "I thought this was a story about a little girl who was thrown away. I was wrong." She paused. Her fingers moved across a button on the coat, the top one, the first one she had placed back. "My parents cut themselves out of my life so I could live. A man I never met spent 74 years keeping a promise he made to them. And every name in that register belongs to someone who was loved by people brave enough to let go." She looked around the room. "We think that love is holding on. Sometimes love is the person who lets go and never tells you why. No one spoke. No one moved. Somewhere outside, a bird sang twice and then went still. After the ceremony, families wandered through the restored classroom. Children touched the old desks. Grandparents explained photographs to grandchildren who listened with wide, serious eyes. The schoolhouse was full of voices for the first time in more than 50 years. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd thinned and the light turned amber, Maggie stepped onto the porch. The hills rolled outward in every direction, gold and copper, beneath the September sun. A breeze moved through the grass, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and something else, something clean and ancient, that belonged only to these mountains. She sat down on the porch step. The tin box rested beside her. She opened it one final time, empty. Every button was where it belonged. On the coat, on her shoulders, against her heart. The box that had carried them for 74 years had completed its purpose. It had kept the pieces safe until the mending could be done. Maggie closed the lid and set the box on the step beside her. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. The wool was warm. The buttons held. Below the hill, a car pulled into the gravel lot. A woman stepped out, elderly, unsteady on her feet, holding a photograph in both hands. She looked up at the schoolhouse with an expression Maggie recognized instantly. The cautious, terrified hope of someone who has been searching for something so long, they are almost afraid to find it. Maggie stood. She brushed off her coat, and she walked down the hill to meet her. Some buttons are decorative. They exist to be admired. Others are structural. They exist to hold things together quietly, invisibly, long after the thread has frayed and the fabric has worn thin. You never notice them until they are gone. And sometimes you never know they were there at all, until someone hands you a coat and you realize it has been waiting for you your entire life. I have one question before you go, and I mean this one. Is there someone in your life who has been quietly holding things together for you, and you have never told them you noticed? If there is, maybe tonight is the night. Leave a comment. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your invitation. I'll see you in the next one.